The death certificate. Hi, I'm Darren Findling of the Probate Pro, and we're going to examine the Michigan Certificate of Death. This particular form is a really important form that gets completed, and it's a long form. Now, in my probate world, we look at this document every day as part of the opening up of a probate estate. It's really a document that is critical to the family because some of the information on the document can be really important for purposes of applying for life insurance benefits as well as opening a probate estate. Let's work our way through the document and understand its use. So I've got some notes here because the document itself is quite long, and hopefully we can kind of work our way through the key aspects of the document together. We're going to start with just understanding that the certificate of death is a document that is required to be provided within 48 hours following the pronouncement of death. Now remember, I use the term pronouncement of death because of course somebody could have died quite a bit earlier had they not been yet discovered and pronounced dead. And in this particular case, the attending physician that is attending is required for doing the pronouncement of death under a particular Michigan statute, MCL 333.2843. Now, although the attending physician has the primary responsibility to identify the deaths, they also are responsible for identifying deaths that should be then investigated by a medical examiner. Now, that's another term for a coroner. Now, we've seen, of course, in TV shows the coroner who very dramatically pronounces the death, but typically it's the attending physician that then refers the case to the medical examiner in very particular circumstances. Those circumstances are when the cause of death is due to a violent or external cause, or it's unexpected, or when the cause of death is unknown to the attendant. Those referrals will occur from the attending physician and be brought over to the medical examiner, again, under a particular statute. Now, it's supposed to be, this certificate of death is retained in the state vital record. So a repository of records, no different than a birth certificate, a marriage license, and so on. It's a permanent record of the legal event that had occurred. And of course, it can be used for so many purposes. I've described a few earlier on, one being when you commence a probate estate, there's a requirement to show proof of death. Now, there are other ways to show proof of death, but the death certificate is the preferred manner upon which to do it. We also know that death certificates are needed to be produced at financial institutions following death, maybe the Register of Deeds to record the termination of a joint owner, or a survivor account that needs to be relinquished by the decedent. In addition, the death certificate is a direct evidence of death for Social Security purposes and other important events that occur following the death. In addition, the death certificate is used also for genealogical purposes for people that are building out their family trees, as well as for meta studies relating to causes of death. It could also be used, for example, in mass tort actions. Just as an example, during many mass tort cases in which the cause of death was from a particular form of cancer, but then years later, I'm going to use the Roundup example, the Monsanto case, that the manner and cause of death may be a determining factor as to whether somebody even qualifies for a mass tort. If the qualifying cancer is reflected on the death certificate, that may be a basis for qualifying even for a tort action. So again, it is a document that's really important to be completed correctly, and often they are not completed correctly. And I did a video that addressed the manner upon which you can correct a misstated death certificate, as well as the frequency upon which death certificates are misreporting really key pieces of information. Now, as you can see at the top red rectangle, some of the real basic information is required. Of course, the decedent's name, that's the name of the person that died, and this information in and of itself can be confusing. The family may use a nickname for the person. I'll give you an example. The famous football coach Bo Schembeckler. His real name isn't Bo, it's George Schembeckler. So the decedent's name is typically provided by the family, the formal name, to the funeral director who completes that information. At the time that the attending physician or the medical examiner is involved, the formal name may not be identified. So it's up to the funeral director for really completing the upper portion of this particular part of the death certificate, because by the time the funeral director is involved, typically the family has all of the requisite information that includes in area 1, the decedent's name, the decedent's date of birth in section 2, sex. Again, this can be a challenging section because it used to be male or female, but now I'm not exactly sure how the state is handling fluidity within identification. Date of death is referenced there, and again, the date of death is completed by the funeral director. It's the certifying physician's responsibility for the accuracy of the particular date. Again, date of death can be confusing, and it can be very important based on the order of death for purposes, for example, of inheritance, for mutuality of death. If two people die at the same time and the beneficiary designation requires a certain number of days to have passed. So the date of death can be a really important factor. Item 5 is name at birth in the event that there's another name used. And then as we continue, the age of as of last birthday, and then section 6B and 6C are the under 1 year, under 1 day section. Section 7, the location of death. Again, the location is where the person was pronounced dead, and it's usually identified by the funeral director. And then, and as we keep moving through the document, again, some very important determinations here that are generally provided by the informant within the death certificate to the funeral director, which is the current residency. County of death is also important because, county of location, which is section 8B, is important because generally probate courts, for venue purposes, use that reference in item 8B to determine whether the county is the appropriate county for commencing a deceased probate estate. So for example, if the person lived half the time in one county, let's say Macomb, and the other half in Wayne, that determination on the death certificate would dictate generally which venue, which county the probate court for purposes of commencing probate. Locality, street address, zip, birthplace, social security number, and then education. All information reported by the informant to the funeral director. Race, again, a challenging section for some people who don't strongly identify in one category because some of the categorizations are very binary. Ancestry, Hispanic origin, again, a factor to determine for genealogical purposes. And then it says, was the decedent in the armed forces under section 14 for purposes of keeping track of those that were part of the U.S. military. Usual occupation, another challenging section there because, as we know, people move around to many different industries. Item 16, the kind of industry. 17, marital status. And 18, the name of the surviving spouse. Again, surviving spouse here, important that this is done correctly. We've seen people who don't identify in the informant section the surviving spouse because maybe they were separated or not in a good marital space, and that information is omitted or not reflected correctly. As we move further down the document in section 19, I'm going to bring down the section here for purposes of identification of father's name, mother's name before first marriage, and then informant's name in relationship to decedent and mailing address. Now again, important information here, the father's name, this again gets confused quite often because father could be biological father, father could be legal father, and it's not particularly clear the designation because Michigan's paternity statute, it has a broad definition of how to particularly determine whether somebody is a legal father, and the informant may list the biological father rather than the legal father. So an important consideration. The informant's name is simply the person providing the information to the funeral director. And then as we move to 21B, their relationship to the decedent and their mailing address. So again, this particular section provided by an informant, the person that is attending or handling the funeral-related events or cremation and burial events to the funeral director. The next particular section says method of disposition. This, of course, relates to cremation, burial, etc., place of disposition, and location. And then we've got a signature line for the mortuary science licensee. Again, that's a fancy word for the funeral director, license number, and the name and address of the facility. That particular section under section 24 of the death certificate. As we continue to move down through the document, there's some certifying information. Now, this is important because this particular section gets completed by the attending physician, the certifying physician. There's a checkbox, and if it's being referred to a medical examiner for some of the reasons that I mentioned, specifically reasons such as a violent death, or if the certifying physician is unclear as to the manner of death, that is referenced there. So that checkbox would be identified, and then there's a signature, and then it talks about actual or presumed time of death, pronounced death date, and time, the medical examiner information under this particular section for 27, and the additional information regarding whether it was referred over to the medical examiner. As we continue to move down the document, this particular section relating to the chain of events, diseases or injuries, complications that directly cause death. And again, this particular section can also be really problematic because we know that often people die of complications in a variety of forms. Generally, of course, the heart stops beating, but is that a heart attack or something else going on there? So we have this cause of death section here as it relates to a disease, abnormality, injury, poisoning that contributed directly or indirectly to the death. And because there's a combination, there's some room here for the for the examiner to identify whether it's due to or as a consequence of varying contributing factors and the approximate interval between the onset and death. And this particular section, I've seen all sorts of problematic language included on there. So for example, if somebody is scuba diving and there's a death, it's hard to know, did they have a heart attack which then caused a drowning? Did they drown because of an accident? Another example is somebody's in a car accident and the blunt force trauma of hitting a tree caused death, but did they have a heart attack, then lose control of the car and hit a tree, or vice versa? So, really challenging section here that can have a lot of implication on how the death certificate and cause of death is treated. And that's why medical examinations and autopsy reports can be really critical to what occurs based on the language on the death certificate itself. And I'm reading from a note here on the description that is provided to the attending physicians and medical examiners. It says the mode of dying, cardiac arrhythmia, cardiac or respiratory arrest, renal failure, etc., should not be stated at all, since it is more of a symptom of the fact of the death occurred and provides no useful information. I'm talking about the cause of death section. These mechanisms of death lack any etiologic specificity and are reflections of the effects of the condition which led to the death, but do not serve to identify the causes of death. The causes of death should not be left blank, and it should not say unknown or natural causes here. And again, a real challenging section here that can also bring a lot of emotion to a family based on the language that's used there. So I know that this particular section can cause families a lot of consternation and frustration. It goes on to ask if tobacco was used or contributed. That was, of course, for tracking tobacco usage, and then if a female, about pregnancy. So it asks for some census information regarding pregnancy if the individual who died is a female. As we continue to work our way down, there's a medical examiner section relating to the date of injury, time of injury in the event that there was an injury that occurred, and how the injury occurred. So if somebody died because of an injury at work or at home, this particular section would provide for the completion of this particular area. So again, this is a very kind of summary view of a death certificate. This document is used and presented in all different types of contexts. There is a certifying seal. We call this a certified death certificate that may be required to be produced for purposes, for example, of accessing finances or bank information. Again, an important document used in a variety of contexts. I'm hopeful that this summary or overview is helpful. Again, if you have questions about it, we'd be happy to discuss this matter with you. At the Probate Pro, we are passionate about everything probate. If you have questions about the death certificate or any probate or trust related issue, visit us at theprobatepro.com or call us at 1-833-PROBATE.